The first sound that tore through that luxurious space was not the swell of strings nor the clink of crystal glasses, but a voice cold and sharp as a metal blade. She does not deserve to sit at this table. One sentence was enough to drag the entire federal state banquet, the gathering place of the nation's political and financial power, into a silence thick as gunpowder smoke. Every gaze locked onto Charlotte Hayes in her vivid orange-red gown, burning bright amid a sea of dark suits. The chandelier light fractured across her skin like shards of broken glass, exposing every shade of emotion. She tried to bury the sting, the familiarity of being wounded, and the invisible armor forged through 41 years of enduring prejudice. Only those perceptive enough could see it. The rest buried themselves in smug satisfaction, following the lead of the woman who had spoken with such contempt, Victoria Langford, 39 years old, born into a family with 4 generations of financial advisors to the government and 2 generations of senators. Victoria's smile curved like a poisoned crescent, her eyes icy with the confidence of someone who believed power was inherited by blood, that every elegant banquet belonged exclusively to white women draped in haute couture, not a black woman in a red dress, even if that black woman controlled tens of billions of dollars in investments. Silver forks froze mid-air. Whispers spread quickly like a sudden gust of wind, but carried the same cowardice. Who invited her? This place is not for people like that. Well, I guess they are trying hard to look diverse lately. Charlotte heard it all. Not because they were loud, but because throughout her life she had learned that insults always echo louder than kindness inside rooms filled with power. She calmly placed her hands on her lap, anchoring herself. Her heartbeat did not rise, but her eyes blinked 1 beat faster than usual, a single beat before settling again into a lake-like stillness. No one could guess what lay beneath that still surface. Across from her, Victoria leaned back in her chair, relaxed, as if the evening existed solely to honor her. Her gaze swept to guests nearby, urging them to join in. Some laughed awkwardly, pretending to agree, because agreement meant safety. Others lowered their eyes in shame, but remained silent, because speaking up meant risking their position in the power structure Victoria and her father, Thomas Langford, had spent decades building. On the raised platform, the string quartet continued playing, but the violin trembled slightly, as if even the instrument could feel the electricity tightening around the room. The elegant atmosphere of the federal banquet, meant to symbolize national unity, distorted into a stage for unfiltered arrogance. Charlotte didn't respond. Not a word. Not a glare. All she did was inhale slowly, as if gathering every particle of air thick with entitlement and discrimination into her chest to cleanse it with her calm. But that calm was not weakness. It was the kind of strength people like Victoria would never understand. At the table to her left, an elderly diplomat's hand trembled as he lifted his wine glass. He was not afraid of Charlotte. He was afraid of her silence. A silence like the skipped beat before a storm detonates. Thomas Langford, 62 years old. Victoria's father had not spoken a single word. He simply observed Charlotte with the eyes of a man more accustomed to ruling than conversing, as if her presence alone violated an unwritten order he believed he had built. What he did not know was that Charlotte's silence was dismantling that order piece by piece. The peak of the evening came at the exact moment the room realized Victoria was not joking. She raised her champagne glass, flicked her wrist, and repeated this time, slower, clearer, and sharp enough to slice the air. These seats are for people who matter. The word matter hit the table like a metal weight. Some guests held their breath, others chuckled loudly, and Charlotte, her eyes narrowed just slightly, and in that tiny movement, the hearts of the perceptive tightened without knowing why. They could not know that the woman being insulted was not just a wealthy investor. She was the silent architect behind federal funds, national infrastructure projects, and nearly half of the government's international partnership investments. A woman whose existence never relied on spotlights yet. She was the only light keeping dozens of political and economic systems running smoothly. And now she had been called not important. One sentence, one moment, a small cut but deep enough. Still Charlotte did not retaliate. She only tapped a finger lightly against the screen of the phone hidden beneath the table. A tiny motion unnoticed by all. But what would happen next would become something the entire hall and the entire country would remember forever. Because they had just insulted the wrong person on the wrong night at the worst possible time. And worst of all, they believed Charlotte Hayes's silence was weakness. They were about to learn the truth, very soon. The State Banquet Hall in Washington, D.C., glowed beneath hundreds of candles and classic crystal chandeliers. Yet even that brilliant light was not warm enough to soften the chilling tension spreading from the center of the long banquet table, a table that stretched like the power corridor of an empire. Charlotte Hayes sat at the place of honor at the far end of the table, the seat reserved for special guests or strategic sponsors. But tonight it had transformed into a hot seat, a spotlight for judgment whispers and discrimination, wrapped in the polished veneer of diplomatic ceremony. Her orange-red gown hugged her balanced figure, radiant enough to draw every eye in the room. But the attention tonight was not admiration, it was scrutiny from people accustomed to viewing the world from above. The quiet clinking of silverware against pure white porcelain continued the conversations of ministers, business leaders, and ambassadors carried on, but Charlotte's presence carved an invisible fracture down the length of the white tablecloth. Some guests glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if 1 second too long would force them to confront something they had spent their whole lives avoiding: a black woman seated at the same level of power as them. Others did not bother hiding their discomfort, especially those seated near Victoria Langford. They tilted their heads, exchanged privileged half-smiles, raised brows with unspoken meaning, and stifled little laughs, sharp enough to make anyone feel out of place, even in a room they were formally invited into. Charlotte felt every gaze move across her skin, each one a fingerprint of prejudice, sharp, cold, assessing, and steeped in the social hierarchy she had fought against her entire life. In front of her, a glass of red wine shimmered, carrying the aroma of oak and ripe berries. She lifted it only to observe the way it caught the light. It was just a fleeting moment. But in that moment, she felt herself detach from the room, detach from the eyes, searching for inferiority, in her detach from the arrogance, inflating like a soap bubble around Victoria. She did not react, did not flinch, yet her silence only made those watching her more uncomfortable. On the banquet table the dishes were arranged like works of art: perfectly sliced beef, expensive fresh seafood, black caviar, smooth as velvet artichokes, roasted with herb butter, releasing an elegant fragrance into the air. But Charlotte tasted none of it, because every breath in this room was saturated with a hierarchy she had encountered far too many times. "Who exactly is she?" a middle-aged man whispered to his wife, lowering his voice, but not enough for Charlotte to miss it. "I heard she's some kind of investor, but she does not really fit the atmosphere here." His wife replied, her gaze trailing from Charlotte's soft waves of hair down to her expensive gown, but stopping with a subtle sense of otherness they could not hide. These days anyone can slip into this banquet, it seems. A simple line, gently spoken, yet sharp enough to slice another fine wound across the calloused surface of Charlotte's spirit. She did not gasp or frown, but deep inside old memories stirred the memory of a black child entering a private school filled entirely with white students. The memory of an intern who was underestimated, despite working twice as hard. The memory of a young investor being told her fashion sense was not appropriate for an executive boardroom. Those memories did not weaken her. They sharpened her, strengthened her, made her see more clearly. To her right, a European ambassador studied her with curiosity, laced with caution. He recognized that Charlotte's stillness was different from timidity or avoidance. It was the stillness of someone who was listening to every whisper, watching every gesture, memorizing every look. That stillness was dangerous, but not for Charlotte. It was dangerous for those underestimating her. Across the table, Victoria continued whispering to her entourage, her dark red lips curving with each story she told. Every time Charlotte caught her eye, Victoria offered a taunting smile, the smile of someone who had stood at the top of the power pyramid so long she had forgotten the base of the pyramid sometimes belonged to someone else. Thomas Langford was different. He did not speak, did not laugh, did not mock Charlotte. But his silence had another meaning, the silence of someone who did not believe Charlotte was worth noticing, the silence of a man convinced that everything happening in this room followed the social order he had engineered. To Thomas, Charlotte was an extraneous detail in the grand painting he had envisioned for this state banquet, a detail too insignificant to matter. But that indifference was his greatest mistake. Because while they judged Charlotte through the lens of race, class, and appearance, Charlotte sat there as the only person in the room who understood the financial flows, the systems, and the power structures operating behind the very projects they were celebrating tonight. She knew every number in the federal budget. She knew every grant, every investment commitment, every foreign fund, every multilateral agreement awaiting approval. And she knew exactly who depended on the capital she provided. But no one in this room knew that. To them, she was only a black woman, seated among a sea of expensive suits and ivory gowns, an intrusion disrupting an invisible order they assumed would always belong to them, and their ignorance would be the first tremor of an earthquake. Charlotte's gaze drifted toward the crystal chandelier above its shimmering light, flawless and impossibly beautiful, yet always hiding countless fine cracks within. Just like this room, just like the people sitting in it. She closed her eyes for 1 second, only one to feel the music, to feel the cold, to feel the weight of every gaze insisting she did not belong. Then she opened her eyes. Her dark pupils were calm, dangerously calm. In that moment, the room did not know that the balance of power had shifted ever so slightly subtle enough to sense only through instinct. And that shift began at the very table they believed Charlotte did not deserve to sit at. They did not know yet, but they were about to learn that Charlotte's seat was not one they allowed her to occupy. It belonged to her. It had belonged to her for a very long time. And tonight they would learn that truth in the most ruthless way possible, the moment Charlotte gently closed her eyes and then opened them again. A thin current of air, cold and razor-sharp, to the point of being invisible, seemed to slip through the entire room, subtle yet powerful enough that even the most sensitive guests felt the atmosphere shift instantly. No one could name that change, but it was strong enough to make a violinist in the quartet hit a wrong note, strong enough to make the minister in the center of the table suddenly tighten his grip around his wine glass, strong enough to make Victoria Langford lose half a second before regaining the arrogant smile she believed was her greatest weapon. Charlotte remained motionless, but her stillness no longer resembled the calm of someone merely trying to maintain composure. It was the stillness of a lone wolf stepping out from the shadows, not growling, not pouncing, yet making every creature in its presence instinctively shrink back. The banquet table glowed brightly under candlelight, yet even that brilliance could not fully illuminate the truth slowly revealing itself. This room had never truly been prepared to face someone like Charlotte, someone who could see through every layer of power they wrapped around themselves. The phone under the table vibrated once as it received a signal from the system operating quietly outside the grounds of the state banquet. Charlotte felt the vibration travel along her hand like a cold electric pulse, but she did not touch it again. One small action earlier had been more than enough. Now everything was moving in perfect sequence. She knew, and she simply had to wait. Meanwhile, Victoria leaned forward, lowering her voice so her loyal circle could hear her next insult clearly. She is trying so hard to fit in, isn't she? A thin, sharp laugh spread through the group, scraping against the air like fingernails dragged along the edge of a glass. Charlotte heard it, understood it, but did not react. She had never been the type to fight with words. People like Victoria never understood the value of silence. They mistook silence for weakness. But Charlotte wielded silence like a finely honed blade, a weapon her opponents never saw until it cut far too deep to repair. Above them, light from the crystal chandelier fractured into 1,000 bright points, glittering like a sky crowded with stars. But when Charlotte looked up, that sky seemed to dim, not because the light waned, but because her gaze was sharpening, becoming colder, narrowing onto the smallest details, the scrape of someone's shoe against the floor, the soft tap of a spoon against porcelain, the tight breaths of guests trying to hide their anxiety behind masks of authority. Charlotte did not miss a single sound, because each sound revealed one truth: this room was trembling under its own weight. 4 seats away from Charlotte, a young financial advisor stared at his phone hidden beneath the table. He had just received the first alert from the International Investment System: temporary suspension of intercontinental infrastructure funds. His eyes widened, blinking rapidly, as if struggling to believe what he was seeing. He glanced around, trying to guess who else had received the same alert. Then another phone vibrated. This time, it belonged to the Japanese ambassador. He raised an eyebrow as if sensing something drifting off the stable course he had trusted for years. And then another, a petroleum magnate. And another, a national budget advisor. A small sound repeated itself softly, yet steadily, spreading through the room like droplets falling into a still lake. Bizz, bizz, bizz. The sound was not loud, but it was dangerous. It was the kind of sound that made people look around, check their screens, and ask questions. They were terrified to hear the answers, too. Victoria continued speaking and laughing, but her expression shifted as the faint vibrations rippled through the banquet table. She looked around, trying to understand why the atmosphere had suddenly become so unnervingly strange. But Charlotte already knew. She could feel the shift in the air itself. Suddenly the lights in the hall flickered, dimmed by half a beat. A minor electrical glitch, perhaps, or maybe just a perception, but enough to make the sharpest observers glance around. Charlotte didn't move. Not a single muscle in her face twitched. She sat with her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, her hands placed evenly on the table, her dark eyes still and reflective, like the untouched surface of a mirror. A silence with weight, a silence that unsettled. Only now did Thomas Langford take notice. He leaned forward, scanning the room. Officials he had known for 3 decades began stretching their necks to check their phones. Some frowned. Some went pale. Some tried to hide their confusion behind fragmented small talk, but their trembling voices betrayed them. In that moment, Charlotte recognized exactly what she had been waiting for, the pre-panic state. A room full of powerful people, yet none of them had any idea what was happening. They did not know because they had never imagined the financial balance of an entire nation could shift in a single night. They did not know because they had never imagined that the catalyst could be a black woman sitting quietly among them. They did not know because they had never bothered to look. Charlotte knew, and that was why her silence grew heavier, denser, like a stone pressed into the room's chest. Her gaze drifted to the far end of the table, where an elderly minister trembled as he tried to set down his glass without spilling. His hand shook so violently that the glass clinked against the plate 3 times. Victoria noticed the reaction. She frowned, and for the first time that evening, her smile collapsed into a tense, flat line. "What is that?" "Why is everyone looking at their phone?" she asked one of her friends, but her voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. The friend answered hesitantly. "There seems to be some sort of alert, something about the investment funds." Which funds, Victoria asked, but halfway through the question, she realized Charlotte was looking directly at her. Not with hostility, not with anger, but with a gaze that made a person feel as if they were standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea how deep the drop was. And just as Victoria froze, all sound in the room seemed to halt, as if the hall was holding its breath, as if the sky itself was lowering, as if the entire room was waiting for judgment. Charlotte tilted her head slightly and inhaled deeply, as if she had just completed a simple task. But inside her, a wave was rising. A wave not of emotion, but of power. A power that did not need to shout. A power that did not need to pound the table. A power that did not come from them. A power none of them had ever prepared to face. And when the phone beneath her table vibrated one final time, a long, steady vibration, like a drum announcing the beginning of a battle, Charlotte knew the storm was no longer something to anticipate. It was already here, in this very room, at this very table where they claimed she did not belong, and this storm carried her name. A soft vibration ran beneath the table like an underground circuit coming alive, and within seconds it spread through the room like a sound no one wanted to hear, but everyone was forced to face. A trade advisor seated near the center of the table lowered his head to look at his phone, his pupils tightening the instant the first line appeared. Temporary suspension of infrastructure, funds by emergency directive. He reread it 3 times, unable to believe his eyes, then scrolled down. Another alert. Request for confirmation of temporary halt on clean energy projects. A cold breath seemed to sweep across the back of his neck, sending a shiver along his spine. When he looked up again, the state banquet hall was still glowing magnificently. Music still played, crystal glasses still sparkled, but to his eyes that splendor now looked coated in ash. He knew this was not normal. Then A second phone vibrated. This time, it belonged to a high-ranking diplomat sitting near Charlotte. He lifted his screen, and within 1 second, the color drained from his face. "Impossible," he whispered under his breath, but Charlotte heard it. The human body is strange, because when fear settles in, even the quietest panic becomes a scream in a room stretched as tight as a violin string. No one in the hall understood what was happening, yet every person sensed something shifting beneath the seemingly solid foundation they had trusted for years. A transportation mogul bent down to read the notification on his phone. When he reached the red line stating, "Withdrawal of capital commitments," his hand trembled, dropping his napkin. The cloth fell softly, but the sound cut through the silence, like fabric tearing the air apart. The people around him grew restless, each one scrambling to check their phone. The vibrations were small, but when they echoed from 10 devices, then 20, then 50, all at once, they grew into a chaotic symphony, rising louder by the second. The violins continued their melody, but the music could no longer overpower the rising tremor, coursing beneath the long banquet table like a quiet earthquake. Victoria Langford looked around, the proud smile on her lips twisting out of shape. She still did not know what was happening, but she realized the most important thing, the center of the banquet herself, was no longer the center. All attention was being pulled toward Charlotte Hayes, not because Charlotte did anything, but because Charlotte did nothing at all. She remained seated, hands on the table eyes, calm, not once reaching for her phone like everyone else. Charlotte was the sole point of stillness in a room sliding into chaos, and that absolute stillness was speaking the loudest. In a room full of powerful people, only one person was not shaken. Only one person did not need to check what was happening, because she was the reason it was happening. A policy researcher with 30 years of experience pushed back his chair and hurried toward Thomas Langford, whispering urgently, "Sir Langford, something unusual is happening with all the strategic funds. They are withdrawing simultaneously," and he had not finished when Thomas's phone vibrated. Thomas glanced at the screen, then glanced again. And again. No one could see his full expression, but along his neck a thin vein rose sharply, a sign well known by those close to him, the moment blood rushed to his chest out of fear. A notification flashed, "Steele Directive, withdraw commitments." Steele, a surname, a code name, a name almost never spoken aloud, appearing only in the deepest classified documents and triple-secured briefings. Thomas knew that name, and he knew who commanded it. But he never imagined that person was sitting in this room. Victoria saw her father's expression shift and cried out in panic, "Father, what happened? You are scaring me." Thomas did not answer. His eyes were locked on Charlotte. A quiet horror spreading across his face, the horror of a man who had stepped onto a bomb without realizing it. Charlotte sensed his stare. She turned and looked directly at Thomas, not smiling, not angry, only a gaze that seemed to cut straight through the soul of a man blinded by his own confidence. That gaze said one thing, "You know who I am now." Other ministers began murmuring anxiously. The infrastructure fund was pulled. Where is the halt order coming from? This cannot be coincidence. Not all at the same time. Who has power on this scale? The question sliced through the air like a scalpel, spinning across a metal table. And Charlotte still said nothing. She did not breathe heavier. She did not lift her glass. She did nothing. But her silence was sharper than any shout, A white-haired diplomat signaled for his aide. "Get headquarters on the line immediately. I want to know what on earth is happening." The aide took 3 steps before his phone vibrated with 3 alerts at once. He froze, then turned back toward his superior with a hollow stare. "Sir, all multilateral partnership projects have been frozen." Silence swept across the hall. Not an ordinary silence, but a thick one, sinking like molten metal into the marble floor. Then a sharp crash cut through the stillness, the sound of a wine glass slipping from the hand of a businesswoman near the center of the table. She covered her mouth in shock when her phone displayed "suspension of all transactions." She looked at Charlotte as if seeing something supernatural. She did not know anything about Charlotte, but instinct told her everything, unfolding in this room, revolved around that woman. And as the 50th, 60th, 70th vibration rippled through the room like a swarm shattering its hive, the entire hall wavered. Not physically, but in power. Chairs that once seemed unmovable now felt precarious. People who once believed themselves untouchable suddenly felt small, like students standing in front of a chalkboard, waiting to be called out. Every person exchanged the same look. This is no longer an incident. A storm was beginning. Not a storm of nature. A storm born from one human being. A human being they had just looked down on. And then, as if confirming it, a single long vibration sounded from Charlotte's phone beneath the table. She knew it was the final signal, the signal that the entire system had fully activated, the signal that every door she needed had opened, the signal that the storm had entered the heart of the banquet, and now Charlotte simply had to step into the center of the hurricane she had created. No one in the room knew what the next few minutes would bring, but they all knew one truth: the woman they insulted was not an ordinary guest, not an ordinary investor, not someone they could dismiss with a single discriminatory remark. She was the center of power, the hidden current beneath the system, the force reshaping the nation's economy even as they sat eating dinner. And they were about to pay the price for their blindness. Charlotte slowly lifted her gaze, scanning the room in one long, deliberate sweep, a sweep that made each person feel as though her eyes had stopped on them. Then she placed her hand on the table, gently. Yet the entire room felt as though the table might split in 2. The storm had formed, and it bore the name Charlotte Hayes. The room sank into a chaotic silence, a silence so compressed it felt like a single deep breath could shatter it. The phone vibrations had faded, replaced by the pounding heartbeats of hundreds of powerful people forced to confront something they had never imagined, that something or someone was manipulating their power right in front of them. Beneath the distant hum of the string quartet, Charlotte Hayes slowly lifted her glass of red wine. The movement was soft, graceful, yet carried the weight of an omen, a signal the entire room, without knowing, had been waiting for. Candlelight refracted through the dark crimson liquid, casting shimmering streaks of light across Charlotte's face, gentle yet dangerous, like a flame roaring behind glass that once seemed harmless. Every gaze was pulled toward her, drawn to her silence, the way matter is pulled into the center of a black hole, no light, no sound, no escape. And then, when the glass reached the height of her eyes, Charlotte spoke. One sentence, a piece of steel wrapped in velvet power. Her voice was low and steady, yet clear enough for even the guests at the far end of the table to hear the faint tremor in each syllable. It was not loud. It was not sharp. But it carried force, the force of someone who knew she did not need to raise her voice to be heard. Charlotte set the glass down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of her plate, a gesture so precise it made some observers hold their breath. Then she continued, her eyes, still unmoving, does not belong to the one who speaks the loudest at the table. The entire room froze. Every face that had mocked her minutes earlier now stared at her, as if hearing a truth they never expected from someone they had dismissed. Charlotte tilted her head slightly, her deep black eyes igniting with a cold glimmer. It belongs to the one who does not need to speak. No one reacted immediately. No one knew what to do, because they realized her words were not aimed solely at Victoria Langford, or at her father, or at those who had looked at Charlotte with contempt at the start of the evening. Those words were meant for all of them. Every face in the room. Every person who believed they held the right to judge someone else. Every person who thought they understood power. Under the table, like a chain reaction, dozens of phone screens lit up at once, but this time no one dared look. No one dared bow their heads. The bluish glow cast across their pale faces, faces accustomed to golden spotlights, not the cold emergency blue glow of incoming crisis. A young man working in national defense budgets inhaled sharply as he read the latest alert: complete capital withdrawal from Strategic Alliance Project. A grey-haired woman from the diplomatic corps dropped her napkin, eyes wide with horror. Impossible, impossible, all at once. A hidden oil magnate near the East End muttered voice, cracking, "Why is it the Steel Directive who has the authority for this order?" But the one who understood fastest and feared deepest was Thomas Langford. He shot up from his chair in a reflex he could not control, sending the high-end oak chair crashing against the floor. Everyone turned. Thomas stared at Charlotte as though looking into the void between survival and collapse. He stammered, a rare sight for a man who had spent half his life perched atop the power pyramid. What have you done?" Charlotte turned to him, her expression showing not anger, but something far stronger, truth. "Me," she said, her voice soft but sharper than any blade. "I have not done anything." A loud exhale escaped from the right side of the table. No one knew whether it was relief or panic stifled by fear. Charlotte continued her gaze, sweeping the hall, stripping each person bare. Everything happening now is a reaction. A silence, as heavy as stone, pressed onto every chest. Charlotte gently interlocked her fingers, her voice dropping lower without losing any strength. A reaction from a system that finally realized it has been treated wrongly. The truth hit the table like a block of metal, immediately shaking the emotional foundation of the room. Victoria Langford sprang to her feet, her voice shrill, trembling from being placed in a weaker position for the first time in her life. "Are you threatening us?" Charlotte turned her gaze toward her, looking at Victoria as though she were a child trying to understand a game far too complex for her intelligence. Threaten Charlotte's lips curved not into a smile, but into something far more unsettling. "If I wanted to threaten you, do you think you would still be standing here, asking that question?" Victoria's face drained of color. Guests looked at one another in panic, pulling their chairs back slightly, as though the air around Charlotte had suddenly become a danger zone. Charlotte didn't shout. She did not slam the table. She did not hiss her words like someone desperate to display authority. Her power came from her calm, a calm so profound it terrified. Then she spoke again, each word dropping with the weight of an anchor, dragging the entire room to the depths of a truth they did not want to face. "This is not retaliation." The collective heartbeat of the room stretched thin. This Charlotte said, her eyes dark, as an abyss is transparency. The table seemed to jolt like a body struck by electricity. An elderly minister's voice shook as he asked, "Are you saying these withdrawal decisions were all prearranged?" Charlotte nodded gently, a confirmation so simple it nearly made several people lose their footing. The system was only waiting for one reason to activate, Charlotte said. And tonight, you gave it that reason. There was no anger in her tone, only a deep, haunting disappointment. Victoria burst out. A joke that was just a joke. Why would that Charlotte cut her off with a single line of authority so overwhelming? The entire crowded hall stopped the breathing because it was not a joke. She looked directly into Victoria's eyes, then at the entire room, as if scanning the very soul of each person. You believe my humiliation is insignificant. But when people in power believe someone's pain is insignificant, that is the moment they sign their own collapse. Another silence swept the room, this one not born from panic, but from painful awakening. Someone whispered, "God, we just triggered the collapse of the system on ourselves." And Charlotte, her eyes filled with a cold, immovable truth, spoke one final line. "Tonight is not the night I used my power. Tonight is the night you finally saw it." The entire room felt suffocated, as if the ceiling was slowly lowering, forcing them to confront the truth. Real power had never rested beneath the lights they stood under, but within the silence of the person they underestimated. Charlotte placed both hands back on the table and bowed her head slightly, as though she had just taught them a lesson without issuing a single threat. The whole room understood. The wind had shifted, and Charlotte Hayes was the only one who knew exactly when it began. They insulted her, and now she had shown them the true weight of someone they never believed could be dangerous. But they were wrong, entirely wrong. And now their awakening had come far too late. The thick, tightening air in the room seemed to pulse as the words, "Steel Directive," continued flashing across the screens of ministers, ambassadors, advisors, and magnates, repeating like an alarm striking directly into their nerves. They tried to fool themselves, telling each other this must be a technical glitch, a temporary system, malfunction, an error from somewhere out there. But in the silent, steady gaze of Charlotte Hayes, they began to understand. This was no accident. This was intention. A diplomat known as the calmest man in the hall braced his hands against the table, sweat dotting his temples. The Steel Directive, do not tell me, he could not finish. Not because he did not know, but because the truth was too enormous to squeeze through a throat locked by fear. At the corner of the table, a young budget advisor inhaled sharply, as though he needed to pull the entire room's air into his lungs just to keep himself upright. He looked at Charlotte, wide-eyed with disbelief and dread. No, impossible, but if this is real, then every gaze locked onto Charlotte, the woman they had called unworthy of sitting at the table. Charlotte did not rise, did not smile, did not justify anything. She simply turned her wrist slightly, letting the chandelier light reflect off the thin ring on her ring finger, a ring not everyone recognized. It carried the engraved logo of Hayes Strategic Group. A symbol seen only in the most classified conference rooms many of the powerful people in this hall would never be allowed to enter. And when the light caught that ring, when a few realized its unmistakable emblem, a wave of shock swept the room like a cold wind. The Secretary of Commerce stumbled to his feet, gripping the table, eyes locked on Charlotte. "No, no, this cannot be you. You are." Charlotte's gaze was still and winter calm, inviting him silently to say the truth he had always known, but never dared confront. He gasped, "You are the principal controller of Hayes' strategic group." Charlotte Hayes is that person. A collective breath trembled through the room. Victoria Langford froze, as if struck across the face, her eyes wide, her head shaking softly, as though she could dislodge the truth appearing before her. "No, this is ridiculous. A black woman, someone like you, could never." Charlotte cut her off with a single look so sharp, Victoria swallowed her own words. She did not need to speak. Her eyes were enough to crush the racist sentence burning in Victoria's throat. Thomas Langford, the one man informed enough to connect every fragment, turned pale as paper. He no longer looked at anyone. He looked only at Charlotte, as though encountering a force capable of shattering his entire worldview with a single breath. Hayes' strategic group holds nearly half the investment capital for national initiatives, including federal infrastructure, renewable energy, international partnerships, he whispered, reciting a truth he once believed he controlled, but had never truly understood. Charlotte slowly tilted her head. Correct. Each word fell like a signal, firing the death knell for the illusions of power this room had clung to for years. Soft camera shutters clicked from the press balcony overhead. Reporters who had expected a dull diplomatic dinner now realized they were capturing history the moment a hidden force stepped out of the shadows and forced the world to face the truth. A female international delegate stammered, "We heard rumors about a mysterious investor behind global development funds, but we thought it was a group, not a single person." Charlotte responded, her voice as light as silk, yet hard as stone. "I never needed to attach my face to money." The results were enough. Several guests inhaled sharply as the meaning struck them. Charlotte's silence for all those years had never been weakness. It had been strength, the kind too powerful to require explanation. She had become the backbone of countless international projects, without ever stepping onto a stage, because she understood one truth: real power does not need applause. But tonight, the very people who underestimated her had forced her into the spotlight. They had awakened a force they never wanted to face. Across the table, Victoria began to babble uncontrollably, words spilling faster than her mind could restrain. No, this has to be fake. Father, say something." But Thomas said nothing. He could not. He stared at Charlotte as though staring into the mouth of an abyss where everything he had built was beginning to crumble. Charlotte rotated her wine-glass eyes, lowering to the deep red liquid, as if she were looking through the history of her own life. "I grew up in a third-floor rental apartment. I once sat in the hallway of my university because people thought I had walked into the wrong class. I was called by the wrong name in meetings. I was dismissed in rooms no different from this one. Those who once believed discrimination was a trivial matter felt chills crawl across their skin." Charlotte's voice carried no resentment, no accusation, only truth. Raw, heavy, undeniable truth. I built my empire with effort, with strategy, with discipline, while you built your power on the Langford name, or the Stanford name, or whichever boarding school groomed you. An elderly minister nearly lost his balance, clutching his chair. "Good Lord," he whispered. Charlotte lifted her eyes, meeting Victoria's for the first time, with a calm so chilling it felt like ice sliding down the spine. "You think I do not belong at this table. But this table exists because I allow it to exist." Several guests covered their mouths. Others lowered their eyes. Some felt as though the world had literally shifted beneath their feet. Everyone understood Charlotte was not boasting power. She was defining it. She did not need to threaten anyone. The truth was the threat. A young advisor asked, trembling, "Then the withdrawal notices. They are all Charlotte," nodded slightly. "The beginning." Faces throughout the room turned ashen. Another minister asked, with desperate disbelief, "Why because of one insult?" Charlotte's tone did not shift. Not because of the insult, but because of the truth beneath it. She looked around the hall, her gaze pausing over each person, as though marking their names on an unseen ledger. "You did not only insult me. You insulted everyone I represent, everyone who has ever been dismissed, everyone who has ever been excluded, everyone who has ever been called unworthy." A cold wind seemed to sweep across the banquet table. Charlotte ended with a line that shattered the room. "And tonight you reminded me why I hold the power to change everything." In that instant, everyone understood the moment Charlotte revealed who she truly was. The balance of power did not simply tilt. It collapsed, and the world they believed unshakable had just been pried open right before their eyes. Charlotte Hayes was not merely a hidden figure. She was the center of the storm, and they, every one of them, had walked straight into it on their own 2 feet. Shock spread like an oil slick across the surface of water, needing only seconds to seep into every breath in the powerful state banquet hall. The moment Charlotte Hayes's identity was revealed, the invisible pillar holding up dozens of corporations, international alliances, and federal projects shook violently, as if someone had pulled out the single pin keeping the entire system upright. Phones continued to vibrate, but now no one dared look at them hastily. Every new notification felt like a hammer striking a building whose foundation had already cracked. The Secretary of Finance, a man famed for his composure, froze mid-motion when he read the latest alert: suspension of funding for 14 national projects. He staggered like someone whose strength had been drained, gripping the edge of the table to keep himself from collapsing. His eyes locked on Charlotte, filled with pure terror, not because she had threatened them, but because he had finally understood the most devastating truth. The woman they had dismissed was the one the entire system depended on. A middle-aged ambassador whispered, like the hiss of a cold wind, "If she withdraws, the market will open in a shade of red we have never seen." An economist beside him nodded, sweat rolling down his temple. Not red blood. From the west side of the table, the rough, trembling voice of a seasoned businessman broke through. "What terrifies me is not that she can withdraw. It is that she has been prepared to withdraw for a very long time." Charlotte heard every word, every tremor of fear spreading through the room, not because she needed confirmation of her power, but because she saw the naked truth. They only felt fear when their interests were threatened, not when someone else's dignity was trampled. That truth did not surprise her, but it chilled her heart slightly. Thomas Langford, the man who believed he controlled the puppets of politics, now stood frozen eyes, reddened like someone waking from a dream he had mistaken for reality for 3 decades. He tried to steady his voice, but failed his tone, trembling like a violin string moments before it snaps. "You do not understand. If you withdraw, so many nations, so many families, so many industries will—" Charlotte cut him off with a sentence sharp enough to pierce through every excuse. "Will have to take responsibility for the choices they made." A few guests nearly burst into tears at that line. They knew Charlotte was right. Responsibility does not disappear simply because they chose to ignore it. A silver-haired magnate whispered, "My God, She warned us for years in reports, in proposals, and we ignored her because we thought she was just a sponsor. A young female minister pressed a hand to her chest, suddenly breathless. No, we ignored her because she is a black woman. The truth struck her own face like a slap. The room went still. For the first time that evening, someone dared to say what everyone knew, but no one admitted. Victoria Langford clung to the table edge, her voice shrill with panic. We cannot be dragged into chaos because of one person, because of her. This is just a trivial insult. Charlotte turned her head toward Victoria, with an expression calm, yet burning with a fire. Victoria would never be capable of understanding. Your words did not collapse the system, the way you see people did. Then Charlotte's gaze shifted to the others, as though she were peeling masks off each face. You are not falling because of me. You are falling because of a rotten power structure. I merely touched the weakness you created yourselves. They felt the truth in every syllable. They could not resist it. They could not pretend they did not hear it. Her words were like a small needle, but filled with enough truth to bring down the entire arrogant edifice they had built. Suddenly, a policy advisor's phone rang loudly, different from the earlier silent vibrations. He turned his screen on, read, then gasped. The banks are reacting. The derivatives market is shifting. Bond yields are collapsing. This is... He looked at Charlotte, eyes wide, as if facing a natural disaster. This is a financial earthquake. Charlotte showed no excitement, no triumph. She simply placed both hands on the table slowly, as if accepting this reality, with the calm of someone who had foreseen the end long ago. Earthquakes, she said softly, only happen when the foundation is weak. Near the end of the table, an investor cried out in despair, "You cannot do this! We depend on your capital." Charlotte gave him a brief glance, her voice low, yet slicing through every conversation. "That is the most dangerous part." He blinked, trembling. What do you mean?" Charlotte looked around the table. "You were never supposed to depend on me, or on anyone. No one should ever hold this much concentrated power." A few people gasped, the realization hitting them like a punch to the chest they had helped create that dependency themselves. But Charlotte was not finished. "You rely on me because you refused to change, refused to correct your mistakes, refused to build a stable foundation for the future. The only thing you worked hard to protect was your privilege." Her words sounded like judgment, but they were simply fundamental truth. Truth no one in that room had ever dared to face. A female ambassador whispered, "Just one insult triggered all of this." Charlotte answered instantly, not letting her finish. It was not one insult. She touched her chest. It was everything that insult represented. The entire room fell dead silent. They finally understood. Victoria began to sob, tears streaking down her face, not from guilt but from fear for her collapsing empire. Thomas sank into his chair, burying his head in his hands, like a man who had just seen a tsunami rising over his horizon. Others looked at Charlotte with fear, respect, and reluctant recognition they had never understood real power. They thought power was the number of seats they held, the meetings they attended, the people they could command. But tonight they learned the bitter truth. Real power is the ability to shift an entire room with one look, and Charlotte Hayes was doing exactly that. When the next wave of alerts exploded across the hall this time like fireworks, everyone flinched, turning toward Charlotte as if awaiting the final verdict. But Charlotte simply closed her eyes for 1 second exhaled slowly, then opened them again, with a gaze that made every person understand the moment of no return had arrived. And the collapse unfolding before them was not Charlotte's. It was their own. The state banquet hall, which moments ago felt as solid as marble and gold, suddenly seemed as fragile as thin glass. Every breath felt sharp enough to shatter the air stretched tight around the table. When the next notification sounded, longer, harsher, cutting through the room like a warning siren, every panicked gaze snapped toward Charlotte Hayes, the only person in the entire hall who didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't tremble under the chaos spreading at an exponential pace, while officials tried to reassure one another with empty words, while advisors fumbled through their phones with sweat-soaked hands. Charlotte simply sat there completely still, the unmoving center of a storm spiraling wildly around her. And that stillness forced everyone to confront the truth they feared most. Charlotte was not just the eye of the storm. She was the creator of it. Thomas Langford finally pushed himself to his feet, not with the authority of a national financial strategist, but with the desperation of a man watching the empire he built crack beneath his shoes. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his voice, but his words trembled like a windshield rattling in a hurricane. Charlotte, this has gone too far. If you withdraw all your capital, the economy will destabilize. We can renegotiate. There must be a way. Charlotte looked at him. Just looked. But that look alone drained the strength from Thomas's legs, sending him collapsing back into his chair as if someone had switched off the power sustaining him. Charlotte's voice rose soft as a drifting breeze, yet sharp enough to rip through every layer of pride. In the room, Sir Langford, what do you think the economy relies on? Your management, the accomplishments you boast about in your speeches? Thomas froze. Charlotte tilted her head. Or does it rely on my capital? The truth pierced through the room like a spear. A few people gasped softly, as if a raw nerve had been struck. She is right. We depend on her far more than we realized. Charlotte continued her voice, never rising yet, each word sinking into them like lead. If an economy can be shaken because one person withdraws, then it is not an economy. It is a rotting structure. A policy advisor swallowed hard, face pale. Are you destroying everything? Charlotte looked straight at him, her eyes reflecting not anger, but truth itself. I am simply removing the one support beam you all leaned on. The building collapses because it was weak, not because I pushed it. Those words struck the guests near the end of the table like a punch to the chest. They began to realize what was collapsing was not only projects and budgets, but illusion. The illusion that power naturally belonged to them. The illusion that they could insult others without consequence. The illusion that they stood at the top of the pyramid, when in reality they were standing on the heel of a woman whose face they had not even bothered to remember. Victoria Langford, still clinging to her arrogance like someone grasping a floating plank in the middle of a stormy sea, suddenly raised her voice. You cannot do this. You cannot make my family make all of us victims because of one slip of the tongue. Charlotte turned to her with a gaze so cold it forced Victoria to take half a step back. A slip of the tongue, Charlotte asked. You call public contempt a slip? Victoria opened her mouth to retort, but Charlotte continued, and this time her tone shifted. It was no longer the icy calm she had carried all evening. It was the flames that had been suppressed for too long, finally rising to the surface. Do you know the worst thing about your empire? The entire room leaned into the question, hypnotized. You think the pain of others is so small it is not even worth an apology." Victoria fell silent. Others held their breath. Charlotte bowed her head slightly, placing her hand on her wine glass, swirling it gently, as if she were stirring every layer of power in the room. "People do not collapse because of a single mistake," Charlotte said. "They collapse because of arrogance." Her words sliced straight into the heart of this multi-million-dollar banquet. When she spoke again, her voice sharpened like a blade. "I am here not to endure humiliation for your comfort. I am here because you need me." She lifted her head. "But you made the mistake of believing that I need you." A few guests covered their mouths to hold back cries of panic. Thomas Langford clenched his fists, struggling against the feeling of being completely exposed, like an aging king stripped of his throne in the middle of his own court. "Charlotte," he said, his voice fraying at the edges. "Do you understand how many people your decisions will affect?" Charlotte looked at him, her dark eyes deep as an abyss. "You are worried only about the people you want to protect. I am worried about the people you have never looked at." Several ministers bowed their heads. For years they had signed endless documents, without ever questioning why their projects always received funding. They had grown accustomed to the benefits, never once tracing the roots of those resources, and now they were being forced to face that root. A black woman they had dismissed. A long-standing ambassador whispered to the person beside him, "We have been living in a bubble. Our entire lives." Charlotte heard him. She did not feel pleased, not triumphant, not vindictive. That admission only weighed heavier on her heart, because she never wanted to destroy them. She wanted them to change. But they had forced her to prove a truth they should have recognized long ago. Victoria darted her eyes around the table, searching desperately for allies, but she found only pale faces, turning away to avoid her gaze. No one wanted to stand with the person who had ignited the catastrophe, and she knew it. Father Victoria whispered, her voice trembling like someone with water rising to her throat. "We have to do something. We cannot let her." Thomas cut her off for the first time, not to protect her, but because he no longer had the strength to lie. "You do not understand. We cannot do anything to someone like her." Victoria froze. Charlotte answered calmly, without mockery or pride, only truth. "Not because my power is great, but because you put all of yours in my hands." Thomas bowed his head, accepting defeat for the first time in his life. The room held no more arguments, no more whispers, no more heavy breaths. Only distant music and the pounding hearts of people who once carried pride, but now shook under truth. Charlotte set her glass down, aligning it perfectly with the table edge, just as before. "This confrontation," she said in a steady, resonant tone, "is not between me and you." The entire room held its breath. Charlotte ended with a line that tilted the entire evening into a new era. "This is a confrontation between truth and arrogance, and not a single person in that hall had the courage to stand on the side of arrogance anymore." The air inside the state banquet hall had grown so dense it almost felt visible, as though fear itself hung in shards between the golden drapes and crystal candelabras. With every passing second, the silence was no longer confusion, but a wordless admission that the people in this room had lost the position they once believed untouchable. When Charlotte Hayes set her wine glass down, a sound so soft it should have meant nothing, it crashed inside their minds like a judge's gavel, marking the moment fate shifted, a moment none of them had the strength to stop. The Commerce Minister's phone vibrated again. He tapped the screen, and cold sweat immediately broke across his forehead as he read the breaking alert, international partners demand explanation, mass withdrawals, doubt over ability to maintain commitments. His face drained of color, his lips moved, but produced no sound. Every trace of political stature melted off him like wax under open flame. A construction magnate let his hands fall limp to his sides, his phone slipping from his grasp and clattering against the marble floor. "No, we are not going to survive this," he whispered like someone watching a disaster roll toward him in real time. The woman who had insulted Charlotte earlier, Victoria Langford, now stood trembling, unable to hold the noble posture she once wore like armor. Each breath caught in her throat as the reality tightening around her family grew heavier by the second. Charlotte Victoria's voice cracked like splintering glass. You cannot wipe everything away like this, my father. His entire career." Charlotte tilted her head toward her, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with the gaze of someone who had walked through every wound and emerged with clarity sharper than steel. His career, Charlotte replied, was built on the silence of the people he did not value. The truth hit so hard that a few guests dragged their chairs back instinctively, as though her words might burn on contact. Thomas Langford sat frozen, his aging eyes staring into a hollow distance. In his gaze was the collapse of a man who had stood on the summit so long he no longer recognized the feeling of the ground breaking beneath him. Around the room, the pings, buzzes, and chimes of dozens of phones rang out like alarm horns announcing the end of an era. A diplomatic advisor whispered, "The media they know they are reporting. Live the steel funds have withdrawn from every national alliance." Another voice read aloud, trembling uncontrollably. European markets opened early, plunging, continuous, uncontrolled. At this point, the panic was no longer in their eyes. It was running through their blood. Charlotte gently placed both hands on the table, her expression no longer reflecting anger or pain, but the calm resolve of someone who had lived in darkness long enough to know that light only turns on when the world is forced to face what it refuses to see. She spoke softly, but her words carried the weight of a verdict. "I am not destroying you. I am simply no longer holding you up." The room trembled. Deep inside, they knew the truth they never wanted to face, all the stability, prestige, and authority they claimed as their own achievements had been standing on the shoulders of someone they never respected. Charlotte continued, her eyes gliding across the collapsing faces. A system falls apart when it is built on arrogance instead of competence. A diplomat broke into tears. A young minister pressed a shaking hand to her forehead as the realization hit everything she thought stable was nothing more than illusion. The room erupted into murmurs, confessions they should have spoken years ago. We were too complacent. We never listened. We ignored injustice. We thought we were untouchable. Charlotte did not smile. She did not revel in their collapse. She did not bask in vindication. She simply looked at them as someone facing a mirror they had avoided for their entire lives. "This is not the moment for you to grieve your reputations," Charlotte said, her tone dropping lower, like the dark stillness before a storm breaks. "This is the moment you understand why they fell." Victoria sobbed not from remorse, but from finally realizing she was not the center of the world. Thomas lifted his head, his voice splintering into desperation. "Charlotte, if you do this, our names will disappear from history." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, then spoke a sentence that chilled the room to its core. "I am not erasing your names. Her hand rested gently over her heart. History simply does not remember those who do not deserve to be remembered. In that moment, the entire room understood. Charlotte Hayes was not seeking revenge. She was restoring truth to where it belonged. In her steady gaze, false power was melting away, and truth was rising, like a verdict, like a mirror, like a storm forcing everyone to relearn humility from the ground up. Charlotte Hayes rose from her chair without a single sound, yet the movement echoed through the hall like distant thunder, rumbling across a sky that had not yet broken into rain. Every person in the room, from powerful ministers to self-assured magnates, watched her with the stunned eyes of people who had just realized they no longer controlled the course of their own lives. Each breath they drew felt heavy as lead, because they understood that the moment Charlotte stood was the moment nothing they knew would ever return to what it once was. The chandelier's light reflected off Charlotte's orange-red dress, making her appear like the center of a halo. No one in that room was worthy of touching. When she placed her hand on the table, the entire hall held its breath. They expected a declaration of fury, a final threat, a sentence of punishment. But Charlotte simply looked around, her calm gaze more terrifying than any explosion of anger. She spoke slowly, clearly, each word landing on the table with weight. You have always believed that power is applause, spotlight praise. She paused, letting her eyes sweep across faces collapsing under truth. But real power is in how the world changes when you stand. One short sentence, yet in that instant, everything in the room seemed to stop. No one moved. No one dared breathe. They feared even the slightest motion might shatter the truth, hanging in the air, like fragile glass. Charlotte opened her handbag and pulled out a thin black folder. Nobody knew what was inside, but every page seemed to carry the weight of a new era. She placed it on the table gently without a sound, yet everyone heard the word, ending ring in their minds. $10 to $12 billion have already left your system, Charlotte said, her tone steady, almost casual, as if reporting the weather. And they will not return. Several people collapsed into their seats like puppets with their strings cut. A magnate burst into tears. A minister whispered, "We will not survive this quarter," like a confession of guilt. But Charlotte did not look at them. She looked past them, toward the future already reshaped by her decision. That money will go where it belongs, to places where it can save a child, build a bridge, open a school, or change a life. Her voice carried no anger, no triumph. It was low, deep, filled with the conviction of someone who had seen a future brighter than the gilded walls around them. You built your empire on selfishness, Charlotte said. I build the future on values. Victoria shot to her feet, streaks of tears across her face, her voice breaking apart. You cannot destroy us like this. We have history, we have influence. We have the right, Charlotte. Turned her head, her gaze sharp as a mirror. Yes, Charlotte replied softly, coldly. And it is exactly because of those things that I cannot allow you to continue. Victoria froze, her lips, trembling words dying in her throat. For the first time in her life, she realized that wealth and privilege could not shield her from truth. Thomas Langford sank deeper into his chair, hands covering his head like a fallen general, who finally understood that he had lost not because his enemies were stronger, but because he had misjudged the woman he once called unworthy of the table. Charlotte looked at him with sadness rather than anger. If you had used your power to lift others up, you would not fear this day. The words hit harder than any accusation, and then, without warning, Charlotte delivered the line that plunged the room into absolute paralysis. I didn't come here to destroy this world. I came to save the part that can still be saved. No one dared argue. No one sided with arrogance anymore. No one still believed they were the center of the story. Everyone understood Charlotte had not stepped out of the shadows. They were the ones who had been dragged out of the comfort of their ignorance. Charlotte turned and walked away from the table. Every step she took echoed on the marble floor, like the drumbeat marking the end of an era. Nobody dared call her back. Nobody dared block her way. Nobody was worthy of standing between her and the door. When Charlotte touched the doorknob, a soft breeze slipped into the room, enough to make the candle flames quiver, as if even the air bowed before her. The door opened. Charlotte stepped through it. She did not look back. She did not need to, because real power never needs an audience. And that night, when Charlotte Hayes left the state banquet hall, she did not just leave a dinner. She left an era, and behind her stood a room full of people who for the first time were forced to face the truth. The woman they dismissed was the one rebuilding the world they had broken. From the perspective of an expert in power and social dynamics, the story of Charlotte Hayes reveals a truth that many power structures try endlessly to conceal. Empires do not fall because of external enemies. They collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. When a system is built on privilege instead of principles, on disdain instead of understanding, a single touch of truth is enough to make the entire foundation crack. Charlotte did not seek revenge. She simply withdrew what belonged to her, and that single action exposed everything. If you believe that dignity matters more than status, that respect must come before authority, then like and subscribe to help spread stories that awaken us the way this one does. Leave a comment with the phrase, "Hold your dignity," to remind one another that sometimes one person standing tall is enough to make an entire system change.